Imagine standing above Earth in the year 1860, not as a human bound by hindsight, but as an alien historian assigned to make a prediction about the future of civilization. You scan the surface of the planet the way a strategist studies a chessboard before the first move is made. You see the British Empire stretching across continents like a colossal shadow, ruling over 1/4 of the Earth as population and controlling the sea lanes that knit global trade together. You see France still basking in the glow of Napoleon's legacy, a cultural titan with a formidable army and a vast colonial footprint. Your eyes drift toward Russia, a landmass so staggeringly large that human maps can barely contain it. A slumbering giant with limitless resources and an empire that spans 11 time zones. And then, almost as an afterthought, you glance at a patch of land in North America called the United States. What you see does not inspire confidence. In 1860, the United States is not a superpower. It is not even stable. It is a country splitting itself apart with a level of internal violence so devastating that later historians would struggle to compare it to anything else on Earth. It is an agrarian backwater by global standards. Half of the nation is literally on fire. The other half is bankrupting itself, trying to keep the country from dissolving into dust. Its currency fluctuates wildly in value. Its military is dwarfed by the professional armies of Europe. Its technological development lags behind Britain and Germany. If you were this alien historian, wagering your interplanetary reputation on which nation would dominate the next centuries, the United States would be the worst bet on the board. And yet, less than a human lifetime later, the unbelievable happens. It is 1945. Europe is a smoldering ruin. The British Empire, once the financial heart of the world, is selling off national treasures to buy grain. France is exhausted. Germany and Japan are flattened. Russia has lost nearly 27 million people. And against this backdrop of collapse, there stands the United States, not merely intact, but ascendant. In 1945, America commands nearly half of the world's economic output. It owns more than 80% of the planet's gold reserves. Its navy is larger than all other navies combined. Its industrial machine is operating at a level no empire in history has ever achieved. Its currency is about to become the backbone of the global financial system. Once a fractured experiment in democracy, America has somehow become the center of the modern world. How did a nation written off as a violent, disorganized frontier society transform into a planetary superpower in under a century? The answer high school textbooks offer: freedom, democracy. Exceptionalism is comforting but incomplete. The real explanation is far more strategic, far more ruthless, and far more intertwined with geography and global conflict than most people ever realize. The truth is that America's rise was not inevitable. It was engineered through a series of advantages, crises, and deliberate maneuvers that created an empire so stable that many Americans today cannot imagine a world where their country is not on top. What follows is not a patriotic fairy tale. It is the autopsy of an empire that mastered geography like a cheat code, weaponized global conflict for economic gain, redesigned the world's financial system to its advantage, and built a technological and cultural sphere so powerful that even rival nations became dependent on it. Whether you admire or resent the United States, understanding this rise is essential because every modern economic system, every oil contract, every international reserve currency, and every global supply chain still operates in the shadow of decisions made between 1860 and 1974. But before we get to Bretton Woods, before the petrodollar, before Silicon Valley, before the Marshall Plan, before the Cold War, we need to understand the one thing that mattered most: the land itself. Because the story of American power begins long before its factories roared to life or its financial institutions took the reins of global commerce. It begins with rivers, soil, mountains, and oceans, the kind of advantages that no government can legislate and no army can conquer. America did not rise because it was morally destined to rise. It rose because the ground beneath its feet made it nearly impossible to fail. And once we strip away the mythology and look at the mechanics, something becomes clear. The American empire wasn't just built. It was constructed on top of a geological jackpot that most nations could only dream of. Before a single soldier marched, before a single factory lit up the night sky, before the United States ever imagined itself as a global power, something far more foundational was already shaping its destiny. The terrain itself, geography, does not usually appear in patriotic speeches or Hollywood films, but it is the invisible architecture behind every empire in history. Rome had the Mediterranean. Britain had the seas. Russia had its vast, frostbitten buffer zones. But the United States, almost absurdly, had all the right pieces in the right places at the right time. as if the continent had been designed by a strategic mastermind. Start with the most obvious advantage, the oceans, to massive bodies of water, the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other, created natural moats that no rival could cross without crippling logistical cost. In Europe, entire civilizations lived in constant paranoia about invasion, because flat terrain meant armies could march across borders in days. France and Germany spilled rivers of blood over the exact same patches of land for 1,000 years. China and Russia faced repeated waves of nomadic conquerors. India suffered centuries of incursions from Central Asia. Geography exposed them. America, by contrast, was shielded. To invade the United States, a foreign military would have to cross thousands of miles of open ocean, land on a fortified coastline, resupply over impossible distances, and fight a nation with home field advantage. It was so unlikely that no major power ever seriously planned it after the 1812 British invasion failed. This allowed America to do something extraordinarily rare in global history. It could focus on building economic strength instead of maintaining massive defensive armies. While Europeans poured their wealth into fortresses, artillery parks, and standing armies, the United States poured its wealth into railroads, mines, factories, farms, and education. Protected by water, America matured behind the perfect defensive walls without the constant fear of annihilation that haunted the old world. But the oceans were only the first part of the cheat code. The second, and even more economically transformative, was the Mississippi River Basin, the largest interconnected system of navigable waterways on the planet. Imagine a natural highway system stretching thousands of miles through the heart of the continent, allowing goods to move from Minnesota to New Orleans at a fraction of the cost of overland transport. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, water transport was the difference between prosperity and irrelevance. It was 30 times cheaper than moving goods by wagon and dramatically cheaper than early rail. This advantage meant a farmer in Iowa could send corn to world markets at a competitive price, while a farmer in Russia, Brazil, or inland China watched transportation costs devour profits. This river system created an internal marketplace so efficient that the United States became economically integrated long before Europe ever did. A nation that can move its goods cheaply is a nation that grows rich quickly, because less money is wasted on moving products and more money is invested in producing them. The Mississippi Basin didn't just move corn and wheat, it moved wealth. It turned the American interior, places that would have been remote wilderness in most countries, into a booming industrial and agricultural engine that fueled national expansion. Then there was the Great Plains, a stretch of arable land so enormous, so fertile, so consistent in rainfall and topography that no other region on Earth could match its agricultural productivity. The Midwest became the breadbasket of the world. While European empires scoured Africa and Asia for farmland and raw materials, the U.S. barely had to look beyond its own borders. Coal, iron, timber, copper, oil, natural gas, the U.S. possessed nearly every resource required for industrialization. Britain needed an empire to survive. Japan needed to conquer. The United States needed only to dig. This abundance of natural resources dramatically lowered the cost of American industrial development. Steel mills could operate near iron deposits. Oil refineries could operate near oil fields. Factories could operate near rivers that powered early machinery or rail lines that distributed goods. Everything was in reach. Infrastructure wasn't a luxury. It was a natural extension of the land itself. But none of this came without a moral price. The United States did not inherit a blank slate. Its geographical blessing was secured through brutal expansionism. Wars against Native American nations, forced relocations, broken treaties, and outright conquest. The violent seizure of land from indigenous tribes, and the annexation of half of Mexico during the Mexican-American War provided the United States with the exact geographic footprint that made superpower status possible. This was not destiny. It was willpower, violence, and a relentless pursuit of continental dominance. By 1900, the map was complete. The U.S. owned its coast, its rivers, its plains, and its resources. It had what geopolitical strategists call strategic depth, the capacity to absorb attacks and still function, thanks to the vast interior that shielded its population and industry. It also had economic cohesion, something Europe lacked for centuries. The United States was a fortress, a factory, and a farm all wrapped into one continuous landmass. Yet even with all of these advantages, the moats, the rivers, the farmland, the resources, the United States was not yet a superpower. It was rich, growing, and geographically unstoppable. But it was not the global leader it would become. It had the potential for hegemony, but not the justification or the opportunity. That opportunity would arrive in the form of Europe's self-destructs. In Part 3, we will watch the old world tear itself apart and see how the United States quietly, profitably, and strategically seized the moment that would turn a developing nation into the creditor of the world and the architect of a new global order. To understand the rise of American power, you must stop thinking like a modern viewer and start thinking like a banker in 1914. Because World War I, usually framed as a tragic, senseless bloodbath in history books, was, from an economic perspective, the single most profitable catastrophe in American history. It was the moment the United States quietly pivoted from a secondary player into the beating financial heart of the Western world. But this transformation didn't happen through battlefield glory. It happened through ledgers, contracts, and the cold arithmetic of survival. Before 1914, the United States was not a superpower. It wasn't even financially independent. It was a debtor nation, meaning it owed more money to European lenders than anyone owed to America. London was the unquestioned financial capital of the world, and Wall Street was little more than an ambitious apprentice. Europeans, particularly the British, owned American railroads, mines, factories, and infrastructure. They controlled the flow of global capital. The United States, despite its geographic advantages, was still economically subordinate. Then Europe did something that changed everything. It lit itself on fire. World War I erupted with unprecedented ferocity. The Western Front chewed through entire generations of men. Industrial warfare drained national treasuries faster than anyone predicted. And while Europe was busy turning itself into a graveyard, the United States watched from across the Atlantic, untouched, uninvaded, and fully operational. This is where the real pivot begins. As the war dragged on, Great Britain and France realized they had a new enemy. Mathematics. Trenches could be filled with soldiers, but factories couldn't fill themselves. Ammunition, artillery, grain, steel, uniforms, vehicles, everything required to keep the war machine running had to come from somewhere. Their factories were under bombardment or converted entirely to war production, leaving them incapable of sustaining the fight, so they turned to the very nation most insulated from the conflict, the United States. American exports surged in a way no modern economy has ever replicated during wartime. In 1914, U.S. exports were worth about $2.4 billion. By 1916, that number had risen to $5.7 billion. The United States became the world's emergency supplier. In this sudden, chaotic marketplace, American corporations evolved from domestic producers into global titans. DuPont, once a modest chemical manufacturer, became the gunpowder empire, producing 40% of the explosives used by Allied forces. Their stock price grew by more than 350% in just a few years. Steel manufacturers boomed. Wheat and cotton prices climbed. Shipyards expanded. Railroad lines multiplied. This wasn't just business, it was transformation. And yet the most important shift was invisible. The flow of capital reversed. Great Britain and France quickly burned through their gold reserves. They couldn't pay cash anymore. So they borrowed, and borrowed, and borrowed again. J.P. Morgan & Co., at the time the most powerful private financial institution in the United States, became the exclusive purchasing agent for the British government. It coordinated massive syndicates of American banks to lend billions to the Allies. Morgan essentially became the financial central nervous system of the Allied war effort. By 1918, the Allies owed the U.S. government and American banks over $10 billion, equivalent to hundreds of billions today. This was the exact moment the United States stopped being a debtor nation and became a creditor to the world. When the war ended, Europe lay shattered, entire cities leveled, economies crippled, populations devastated, debts soaring into the stratosphere. Great Britain, the empire on which the sun never set, now owed billions to the United States. And the United States, its homeland, was untouched. Its factories were enriched. Its banks were empowered. Its gold reserves were overflowing. This enormous wealth injection, the transfer of European capital into American hands, helped fuel the roaring 1920s. Flappers dancing in speakeasies, skyscrapers rising in Manhattan, jazz echoing from Harlem nightlife. Behind the glamour was a silent engine, the interest payments from allied governments. But with this newfound wealth came arrogance and miscalculation. When the war ended, the Allies begged Washington for debt forgiveness. Their economies were crippled. Their markets were struggling. Their currencies were unstable. They needed relief. The United States refused. Instead, America demanded repayment. Full repayment from countries whose treasuries had been hollowed out by war. Meanwhile, the U.S. erected high tariffs, making it nearly impossible for Europe to sell goods to Americans and earn the money required to repay those debts. It was an economic contradiction, America demanded payment while simultaneously blocking the only means of payment. This policy, short-sighted, rigid, and rooted in domestic politics, helped to stabilize European economies during the fragile post-war period. One of the German economists at the time noted, "The Allies are trying to pay a debt with a currency they cannot earn." It was an impossible equation. The consequences were profound. Economic instability contributed to political extremism. The Weimar Republic struggled to survive. Inflation soared. Social unrest followed. And in the vacuum formed by economic despair, radical leaders rose to power, including Adolf Hitler. In hindsight, this rigid American insistence on repayment unintentionally sowed the seeds of the Second World War. But from a pure power perspective, the damage was already done. Europe had lost its dominance. The United States had ascended. Yet incredibly, America was still not a military superpower. Not yet. Despite its newfound wealth, the US Army in the 1930s was roughly the size of Portugal's. America had money, resources, and geography, but not military might. To become the hegemon of the modern world, the United States needed one more disaster, one more collapse of the old world, one more opportunity to step into the vacuum. And in 1939, that opportunity arrived with thunder. If World War I made the United States rich, World War II made it untouchable. This was the moment the nation stopped being merely influential and ascended to a level of power the world had never seen. Economic, military, and geopolitical dominance fused into a single empire. But to understand why America's rise during WWII was so explosive, you have to start with where it stood at the beginning, asleep, divided, humbled by the Great Depression, and completely unprepared for global warfare. In 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland, the American military was embarrassingly small. The US Army ranked 17th in the world, behind Portugal. Its equipment was outdated, its budgets thin, and its isolation as public had little appetite for another European conflict. The trauma of World War I lingered, and the Great Depression had drained national confidence. In fact, at the dawn of World War II, few would have predicted that the United States was about to become the unmatched industrial god of the modern age. Then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, and in a single morning, American hesitation evaporated. The sleeping giant didn't just wake up, it stood up, stretched, and began building a military machine of such scale that no nation before or since has matched it. What followed was the greatest industrial mobilization in human history, a transformation so vast that economists still use it as the gold standard for rapid production capability. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood exactly what was required, a level of manufacturing output that would overwhelm the Axis powers not just on the battlefield, but at the factory floor. He demanded 50,000 aircraft per year, more planes than the entire world had ever collectively produced in 12 months. Advisors warned him it was impossible. Aircraft plants were too small, supply chains too limited, workers too few. By 1944, the United States was producing 96,000 aircraft annually, nearly doubling the target. Factories sprouted like steel forests. Automakers stopped making cars and started producing tanks, jeeps, and bombers. The Willow Run plant, built by Ford Motor Company, became the symbol of this new industrial religion, stretching nearly a mile long. With production lines so massive they resembled cities under one roof, Willow Run produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, in the time it takes you to watch the sitcom episodes on Netflix. Ford produced a flying war machine capable of flattening enemy cities. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 71,000 ships, 2.6 million machine guns, and nearly 500 million rounds of ammunition. America wasn't just supplying itself, it was supplying the world. And that is the part of the story that gets overlooked in high school textbooks. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops were fighting some of the bloodiest battles in history. But what kept their war? Machine operating, American trucks, American fuel, American aluminum, American food. The Lend-Lease program shipped about $50 billion worth of goods, more than $700 billion in today as money to allied nations. The Soviet Red Army didn't ride into Berlin on domestically built vehicles. They rode in American Studebaker trucks. Stalin himself later admitted, without American equipment, the war would have been lost. The British relied heavily on American aircraft, destroyers, radar equipment, and food supplies. Even Allied victory in North Africa was largely enabled by American logistics. This wasn't charity, this was strategy. By supplying the world, the United States made every Allied victory dependent on American industrial power. The country became the indispensable ally, the supplier of freedom, the arsenal of democracy. Once you become the supplier of the world's war effort, You become the architect of the world that follows. While Berlin and Tokyo were being reduced to rubble and London struggled under the weight of debt, New York and Detroit glow with factories running 24/7s. America's homeland was never bombed, never invaded, never reduced to ashes. While every other major economy collapsed, the United States expanded. While other nations rationed food, the United States increased farm output. While Europe starved, America accumulated wealth. The U.S. economy produced 50% of global GDP. The U.S. was the only country with nuclear weapons. This wasn't a normal rise to power. It was a cataclysmic reshuffling of the global order. Europe's industrial base was shattered. Japan's cities were reduced to ash. Only one major power emerged from the war stronger than when it entered. But the genius of American strategy wasn't just winning the war militarily. It was engineering a global system after the war that guaranteed permanent dominance. The U.S. didn't just win World War II. It redesigned the world so that it would stay on top indefinitely. To understand this, we must look not at battles, but at bankers. A different kind of battle was unfolding in a quiet New Hampshire hotel. While the last battles of World War II were still raging, another war was quietly being won. Not with tanks, but with contracts, not with bullets, but with balance sheets. This war was fought in meeting rooms and hotel lounges, far from the front lines. Yet its outcome would shape the next 80 years of global power. This is the real reason the United States didn't just win WWII. It locked in its supremacy for generations. The year is 1944. The Allies know they will win. Germany is retreating on both fronts. Japan is losing islands every month. And the world is preparing for an uneasy peace. But peace alone isn't enough. Europe is a corpse, bombed, starved, indebted, incapable of rebuilding itself without help. If the global economy collapses again, like it did after World War I, another Hitler could rise. This time, the United States is determined not to repeat the mistakes that gave birth to fascism and global depression. And so, 44 nations gathered at a quiet luxury hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to decide how the world economy would function after the war. Think of it as the world's reset meeting. Except one country walked into the room holding 80% of the world's gold, half the world's GDP, and the only intact industrial base. There was never going to be a fair negotiation. The United States had already won before the conference even began. The British hoped to salvage some of their fading empire. They sent John Maynard Keynes, the most brilliant economist of the century, who proposed a neutral global currency, the Bancor. Keynes envisioned a balanced international system that wouldn't allow any country, not even the United States, to dominate the world's financial foundations. But the United States sent Harry Dexter White, a Treasury official who understood something essential. Money is power. And if America controlled the global money system, it would control the world. So White listened to Keynes, nodded politely, and then did the geopolitical equivalent of flipping the table. His message was simple: that's cute, but we have all the gold, so we're doing it our way. And our way became Bretton Woods. Under the new system, every currency on earth would be tied to the US dollar, and the US dollar itself would be tied to gold, exactly $35 per ounce. Overnight, the dollar didn't just become important, it became the backbone of global finance. If France wanted to buy Saudi oil, it now needed US dollars. If Japan wanted to build factories, it needed US dollars. If Brazil wanted foreign investment, it needed US dollars. The dollar became the oxygen of world trade, and Washington became the planet's financial lungs. This was the most successful power grab in modern history. And most people today still don't realize what happened. By forcing all global trade through the dollar, the United States created an elegant but ruthless loop. Countries had to earn dollars to buy essential goods, and the easiest way to earn dollars was to sell goods to the United States. Suddenly, the US wasn't just a country, it was the world's store, bank, clearinghouse, and insurance company. To solidify this new empire, the US created two institutions, the International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank. Officially, their purpose was to stabilize global markets and help developing nations. In reality, they served as financial puppet strings. If a country needed money, it had to come to the US, backed IMF. And the IMF never gives free money. Loans always come with conditions. Privatize your industries, open your markets to American corporations, cut subsidies, sell assets, align your economy with US interests. It was economic assistance the same way a loan shark offers friendly help. In Europe, broken and bankrupt, was hooked instantly. They needed American money. They needed American factories. They needed American markets. The new global system ensured that they would always need America. But Bretton Woods had another problem to solve. Europe and Japan were so devastated that they couldn't buy American goods even if they wanted to. Without customers, even the world's strongest industrial giant would stall. So the US created the Marshall Plan, a massive $13 billion reconstruction program that rebuilt Western Europe from the ground up. History books treat the Marshall Plan like an act of incredible generosity. In truth, it was a masterclass in strategic investment. The US taxed its own citizens, then loaned or granted that money to Europe, with the condition that Europeans spend it on American-made tractors, steel, machinery, food, and raw materials. Every dollar sent abroad boomeranged directly back into American industries. Factories in Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania thrived. US corporations grew into multinational giants. Europe got rebuilt, but it became structurally dependent on the United States for finance, trade, and security. And by forcing Europe to align its economies with Washington, the US effectively built a Western bloc of nations economically locked into its system. By 1950, the US dollar wasn't just the world's reserve currency, it was the world's bloodstream. Every major trade, investment, loan, and reserve flowed through it. And as long as every country needed dollars, the US could print them at will. This was the dollar trap, a beautifully engineered system where the United States could run massive deficits without consequences because the world would always need more dollars. Other nations had to earn their currency. The US could simply create it. Other nations had to produce goods to get rich. The US could print money and buy those goods. Bretton Woods turned America's printing press into the world's most powerful economic weapon. But there was one catch. The gold standard part of the system, promising $35 for every ounce of gold, was a time bomb waiting to explode. Countries like France started realizing the US was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. That imbalance eventually triggered a crisis in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a crisis that would force America to pull off one of the greatest financial pivots in history, a pivot that would give birth to the petrodollar and transform a collapsing monetary system into a new empire built on oil, energy, and leverage. Before we get there, though, one thing is clear. Bretton Woods was not just a treaty. It was the moment America stopped competing with other nations and started refereeing the global game. It was the moment the US ensured the next 80 years of worldwide economic dominance. By 1947, Europe wasn't just damaged, it was dying. Cities lay in ruins, factories were gutted, inflation ran wild, currencies collapsed, and millions hovered on the edge of starvation. France rationed bread for years. Britain was bankrupt. Italy faced political chaos. Germany was rubble. The continent that once dominated global power had become a humanitarian crisis zone. In that desperation, America saw both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was communism. The opportunity was empire. Communist parties in France and Italy were gaining alarming strength. Strikes shut down entire industries. Soviet influence seeped into the political bloodstream of Western Europe. Washington realized something terrifying. If Europe collapsed, the Soviet Union wouldn't need to invade. The continent would fall into its lap like a rotten apple. And if that happened, the United States would lose its greatest markets, its economic partners, and its geopolitical buffer. So the US devised one of the most brilliant geopolitical maneuvers in modern history, the Marshall Plan. History textbooks paint the Marshall Plan as a remarkable act of American generosity, a benevolent big brother rescuing Europe out of compassion. The truth is far more strategic. The United States wasn't giving away money, it was buying the future. The Marshall Plan pledged around $13 billion in aid, about $150 billion today, distributed to Western European nations to rebuild industries, infrastructure, and institutions. But this wasn't a blank check. It was a controlled financial pipeline, designed to engineer Europe's recovery in a way that permanently tied it to the United States. For example, a massive portion of Marshall Plan funds had to be spent on American goods. If France received a shipment of US dollars for reconstruction, those dollars were often required to be used to purchase American tractors, American machinery, American grain, American coal, or American manufacturing equipment. The money left Washington, circled through Europe, and then came back to American corporations. It was the world's most successful boomerang. The plan acted as a stimulus package, not just for Europe, but for the entire American industrial base. Factories that had produced tanks and bombers were retooled to produce steel beams, locomotives, turbines, and agricultural equipment. The war economy shifted seamlessly into a peace economy, with Europe serving as the new customer base. It was economic CPR both for the Atlantic Alliance and for US manufacturing giants. But another layer of the Marshall Plan is even more significant: political alignment. Accepting Marshall aid came with ideological strings. Nations had to cooperate economically, rebuild democratic institutions, suppress communist parties, and align their foreign policies with Washington. To receive the money, European governments effectively signed a long-term loyalty contract. They agreed to open their markets to American businesses, adopt U.S.-friendly political frameworks, and integrate their economies into a U.S.-led system. If the Soviet Union offered a competing alliance, nations who accepted Marshall aid were already financially tethered to the West. The United States wasn't just rebuilding Europe, it was reconstructing Europe in its own image. The post-war governments of France, West Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands were designed with American oversight and American influence. Even there, intelligence agencies and central banks were shaped in part by U.S. advisors deployed during Reconstruction. This is the part of the story most people never hear. The Marshall Plan wasn't just money. It was a strategy to reformat an entire continent. And it worked so effectively that Western Europe still carries the political and economic fingerprints of American design. But while Western Europe was rebuilt, Eastern Europe was locked behind the Iron Curtain. Stalin refused Marshall aid, fearing, correctly, that it would tether the Soviet sphere to Western influence. This set the stage for the Cold War's geopolitical map: prosperous American-aligned nations in the West, authoritarian Soviet-controlled states in the East. As Europe rebuilt, the American military pivoted as well. Troops stationed across the continent during WWII never left. American bases were established in Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, the UK, and beyond. This network would become the architecture of NATO, a security alliance that made the US not just Europe's banker, but its permanent bodyguard. The Marshall Plan had achieved something unprecedented: fused economic recovery, political alignment, and military dependency into a single framework. Europe would recover, yes, but only within the structure of an American-led order. And as Europe grew, America grew with it. But this new empire had a shadow. A massive industrial machine had been built during WWII that employed millions and generated unimaginable wealth. What happens when the war ends? What happens when tank factories no longer have tanks to build? Washington had an answer: build a permanent wartime economy. This transformation would give birth to the military-industrial complex, a self-perpetuating machine of weapons, contracts, lobbying, and geopolitical maneuvering that continues to shape U.S. foreign policy to this day. It ensured that the factories stayed open, the budget stayed high, and America remained a military superpower even in peacetime. And this brings us to the next phase of the American rise, one built not on bombs falling in Europe, but on a new kind of warfare: economic leverage, technological dominance, and the creation of an industrial military ecosystem that required endless global engagement to sustain itself. By the late 1940s, the United States stood at the peak of human strength. Its factories were overflowing, its wealth was unmatched, its rivals were in ruins, and its military was the only one on Earth with nuclear weapons. But underneath this triumph was a new, existential question: what happens when the war economy has nowhere left to fight? During WWII, American industry operated at levels previously unimaginable. Millions of workers built tanks, bombers, ships, radios, rifles, and engines around the clock. Entire cities sprang up around defense production. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. Wartime demand had lifted the United States out of the Great Depression, and victory had proven that industrial might could shape the world. But peace brought a dangerous dilemma. If the U.S. suddenly stopped producing military equipment, millions of jobs would vanish. Factories would close. A recession, or even a depression, could erupt overnight. The economy had become structurally dependent on the machinery of conflict. The question was no longer whether America wanted a massive military. It was whether America could even function without one. This was the birth of the military-industrial complex, a phrase President Dwight D. Eisenhower would later warn the nation about. Eisenhower, a five-star general and the hero who defeated Hitler, understood exactly what had been created: a permanent ecosystem where the government, the military, and corporations were intertwined in a cycle of mutual benefit. The mechanics of this system were straightforward. The military requested weapons. Defense companies like Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Dynamics built them. Congress, influenced by lobbyists and pressured by the promise of jobs in their districts, approved the budgets year after year. Military leaders demanded superiority against every conceivable enemy, real or imagined. Defense contractors promised cutting-edge innovations, and the economy absorbed the immense spending through millions of jobs and new technologies. But this cycle created an unusual incentive. The United States needed global tension to justify its massive defense spending. Peace was financially dangerous. Conflict, or at least the threat of conflict, became economically stabilizing. The Cold War provided the perfect, long-term engine for this new structure. After WWII, the Soviet Union transformed from ally to existential adversary. Two nuclear-armed giants faced each other across Europe. To justify continuous military buildup, Washington framed the conflict as a battle for civilization itself. Schools conducted nuclear drills. Propaganda painted the Soviets as expansionist and unstoppable. The fear of communism became a political and economic tool. Out of this environment came secretive documents like an SC-68, a 1950s directive that argued for permanent military mobilization to contain the Soviet threat. And SC-68 didn't just call for more troops or occasional buildups. It argued for an entire American economy structured around preparedness, with defense spending forming the backbone of national stability. This decision reshaped the country. Defense budgets soared. Millions of Americans found lifelong careers in defense industries. Entire towns emerged around bases, laboratories, and naval yards. The economy became anchored to military expenditure in a way no previous empire had ever attempted. But the most extraordinary consequence of the military-industrial complex wasn't economic. It was technological. To defeat the Soviets, the US poured trillions into research and development. Innovation became a byproduct of preparing for war. The internet was born as ARPANET, a Pentagon project designed to maintain communication after nuclear strikes. GPS was created so missiles could strike their targets with precision. Microchips were developed for missile guidance systems long before they powered home computers. Jet engines, satellites, advanced materials, and countless other technologies began as military necessities before transforming civilian life. Silicon Valley itself grew from Cold War money, long before it was filled with startups and social media giants. It was a cluster of defense contractors building electronics for the Pentagon. The modern digital world, from smartphones to cloud computing, emerged from the competition to out-innovate the Soviet Union. As America expanded its technological reach, it also deepened its global footprint. Bases appeared across the world in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Italy, Turkey, and dozens of other nations. This network allowed the US to project power anywhere, anytime, reinforcing its military dominance and ensuring the continuity of the defense economy. However, this enormous machine had a hidden cost. Once the Cold War became the economic engine of the United States, peace became inconvenient. Conflicts like Korea, Vietnam, and later the Middle East interventions all emerged within a system incentivized to maintain global engagement. The US defense industry had grown so large, so influential, and so integrated into federal policy that stepping away from global policing became nearly unthinkable. Eisenhower foresaw this danger in his 1961 farewell address. His warning, deeply unusual for a military hero, admitted that the country had unintentionally created a monster. He cautioned that the unwarranted influence of defense contractors and military leadership could shape not just policy, but the future of democracy itself. Yet despite the warning, the military-industrial complex continued to expand. Defense spending remained enormous even after the Soviet Union collapsed. The cycle endured: higher budgets, new technologies, more bases, and a constant readiness for conflict. By the 21st century, the United States had become a nation where war was no longer an event. It was a condition, endless, decentralized, global, and profitable. But as powerful as this system made America, it was only one part of the story. True global dominance required more than just weapons. It required a financial system that guaranteed American supremacy even in times of peace. It required a global economy that flowed through the US dollar, and a geopolitical structure designed around American interests. And that next chapter begins in a quiet hotel in New Hampshire. To understand how the United States became not just a military superpower, but the financial axis around which the world now spins, you have to step into a fancy, but otherwise unremarkable hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. In the summer of 1944, the war was still raging, cities still burning, armies still dying, but behind closed doors, the American government was quietly engineering the single greatest economic power grab in human history. What happened there would determine how every nation would trade, borrow, grow, and survive for the next 8 decades. And almost nobody outside the political and financial elite understood just how extraordinary the shift truly was. The United States entered the Bretton Woods Conference in a position of nearly divine leverage. Europe was shattered, factories were destroyed, currencies were unstable, gold reserves were depleted. Even the once mighty British Empire was nearly bankrupt. Its homeland was untouched by war. Its industrial output dominated the planet. Most importantly, it controlled roughly 2/3 of the world's monetary gold reserves. a staggering imbalance that made almost every other nation financially dependent before the negotiations even began. 4 countries arrived in Bretton Woods, with competing visions of how to rebuild global finance. Great Britain sent its intellectual superstar, John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist alive at the time. Keynes believed the world needed a fair, balanced system, a new global currency called the BAM core, which would be managed by a neutral international institution. It was an elegant idea designed to prevent any one country from dominating global trade. Keynes envisioned a future where no single nation could turn economic influence into political control. But the United States had no interest in fairness or neutrality. It wanted control, it wanted leverage, and it wanted a system where its own domestic currency would become the central gear of the entire global machine. To achieve that, the US sent a man named Harry Dexter White, not an economic philosopher like Keynes, but a strategist. White understood that the true purpose of Bretton Woods was not to rebuild the world, it was to reorganize it. He knew the United States was in a position to dictate terms. He knew the world needed American loans, American goods, and American security. And he used that reality as the foundation for a breathtakingly bold proposal. White's plan effectively said, "We control the gold, so we control the rules." Under the Bretton Woods system, the U.S. dollar would be fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. All other nations' currencies would be fixed to the dollar. If France wanted to buy oil, it would need dollars. If Brazil wanted to purchase machinery, it would need dollars. If Japan wanted to stabilize its currency, it would rely on American reserves. Over time, the dollar would become more than a national currency. It would become the bloodstream of global trade. This was not a random arrangement. It was a deliberate trap, a soft, elegant trap cloaked in the language of international cooperation. By linking their economies to the dollar, the 44 participating nations made themselves permanently vulnerable to American monetary decisions. If the U.S. inflated its currency, every country felt the consequences. If the U.S. tightened supply, capital flows everywhere reacted. Nations could no longer operate independently. They were tethered to Washington's financial pulse. The free world was now living inside a dollar-denominated ecosystem designed and maintained by the United States. Two new institutions emerged to enforce this American-led architecture: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Their public purpose was noble: to stabilize currencies, rebuild economies, and prevent future crises. But the private, unspoken reality was that they preserved U.S. financial dominance. Member nations that needed assistance received loans denominated in dollars and conditioned on adopting policies friendly to American interest. It was soft power disguised as humanitarian aid. Borrowers were often required to open their markets to U.S. corporations, privatize industries, or adopt austerity measures that reinforced dependence on American finance. While other nations struggled to rebuild from the ashes of war, the United States used Bretton Woods to hard-code itself into the center of global commerce. It was one of the greatest geopolitical maneuvers of all time, a structural advantage so powerful that it outlasted presidents, wars, and economic cycles. Even today, when countries sanction one another, defend their currencies, or try to attract investment, they are responding to a system the U.S. created for its own benefit nearly 80 years ago. But there was a flaw in the design, a crack in the architecture that would grow wider with each passing decade. Bretton Woods was built on the assumption that the United States would behave responsibly and maintain enough gold to back every dollar circulating around the world. But as American spending exploded in the 1950s and 1960s on highways, social programs, and most of all, the enormous machinery of the Cold War, the supply of dollars grew far faster than the gold reserves. Foreign governments began to notice the imbalance. Charles de Gaulle, the French president, became one of the system's most outspoken critics. He saw Bretton Woods for what it truly was, a mechanism that allowed the United States to buy real goods from the world in exchange for paper promises. Why should France trade valuable machinery, wine, or automobiles for dollars that might not even be fully backed by gold? De Gaulle didn't just complain, he acted. He sent French warships to New York loaded with U.S. dollars to exchange for gold. Other nations soon followed. By 1971, America's gold reserve was collapsing. More dollars existed abroad than the U.S. could ever redeem. In a stunning moment on live television that would reshape global economics forever, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer honor the gold convertibility of the dollar. In a single stroke, he ended the Bretton Woods system. The dollar became a fiat currency backed by nothing but faith and American power. The world panicked. Currencies fluctuated wildly. Inflation surged. Economists feared global collapse. But what appeared to be a crisis was actually the beginning of America's next transformation. The United States was free from gold, free from constraints, and free to leverage its financial dominance in ways the Bretton Woods architects could never have predicted. It wasn't the end of American supremacy. It was an upgrade. But a fiat dollar needed something new, something powerful enough to anchor the global economy in Washington's favor. And only one commodity on Earth was important enough to serve that purpose: oil. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the world assumed the United States had simply won the geopolitical contest. In reality, the battlefield had merely changed shape for centuries. Empires fought over land, ports, and shipping routes, but by the late 20th century, a new frontier was emerging, one built not of soil or steel, but of circuits and code. This was the birth of the digital age, and the United States captured it before its rivals even realized what it meant. The irony is almost poetic. The very technologies designed to wage nuclear war ended up becoming the infrastructure of modern life. The early internet ARPANET was created by the Pentagon to preserve communication during a nuclear strike. GPS satellites were designed to guide missiles, not minivans. Microchips were developed so missiles could think faster than human pilots. The American military-industrial complex, in its race to out-invent the Soviet Union, accidentally built the blueprint for a global digital empire. By the 1990s, when Washington opened the gates and allowed private companies to commercialize these technologies, the United States was years ahead of everyone else. What followed was less a competition and more land grab. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Meta didn't just dominate the market, they became the platforms through which the world communicates, shops, entertains itself, and processes its thoughts. Today, the world operates inside American architecture. A German startup hosts its data on Amazon servers in Virginia. A Brazilian influencer lives on Instagram, a platform owned by an American corporation. An Indian company relies on Google's advertising engine to survive. Even foreign governments route classified discussions across American-made devices, using operating systems coded in Silicon Valley. This isn't just economic power, it's informational gravity. Through intelligence programs such as PRISM, the United States gained unprecedented visibility into global communications. While rival nations tried to build their walled gardens, China with WeChat and Alibaba, Russia with Contact, the Western world remained firmly inside the US technological ecosystem. Data became the new oil, and America owned every major pipeline. This digital empire operates quietly, without soldiers or bases. It doesn't need invasions because people willingly carry its tools in their pockets. It is soft domination encoded into daily life logins, passwords, cloud backups, streaming services, social feeds. It is the most sophisticated form of influence ever engineered, because people do not resist an empire they cannot see. And yet, even this empire has vulnerabilities. The same innovation machine that lifted the United States to global supremacy is now producing tools, AI, automation, quantum computing that could destabilize the very society that created them. For the first time since the birth of Silicon Valley, America faces competitors who understand the rules of the digital realm and are building alternatives to escape its orbital pull. The United States still sits atop the digital world, but the foundations beneath it are beginning to shift, and the next chapter of the global story will be written by those who understand that data, not armies, is the true weapon of the 21st century. As the United States reached the peak of its power, it also began sowing the seeds of its own vulnerability. The empire that once felt indestructible is now weighed down by three converging forces. Forces no army can stop and no technology can outrun. The first is the debt spiral, a slow-motion avalanche that threatens the structural integrity of the American state. The U.S. national debt isn't just large, it's accelerating. Every year, the government borrows more to pay for obligations it can no longer cover through taxation. Interest payments have exploded to the point where they now exceed the entire defense budget. This means the world's most powerful military is, for the first time, financially overshadowed by the cost of its own past excesses. Debt becomes dangerous not because of the number itself, but because of the psychological shift that accompanies it. Nations, banks, and investors begin to question whether the U.S. can maintain its financial supremacy indefinitely. A superpower's strength is built on confidence. Once confidence cracks, power follows. The second vulnerability emerged from a move that American policymakers believed would demonstrate overwhelming strength. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States froze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian assets and removed Russia from the SWIFT global banking system. It was a powerful strike, but every other nation took notes. They realized the US dollar was not just a currency, it was a weapon. Countries that once relied on American financial protection now fear American financial punishment. China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and dozens of others began quietly constructing escape hatches, bilateral trade agreements that bypass the dollar, digital currencies, alternative banking networks, and the rise of BRICS as a counterweight to Western hegemony. The petrodollar system, once untouchable, now faces the first legitimate challenges in 50 years. The third vulnerability is the most dangerous because it lies inside the American psyche. No external enemy can collapse the United States faster than internal division. The polarization of modern American politics is no longer a cultural disagreement. It is a structural fracture. Elections are contested not just in debates, but in legitimacy. Legislatures operate in paralysis. Government shutdowns have become routine. Half the nation believes the other half is an existential threat to the republic. A superpower's greatest strength is unity. A superpower's greatest weakness is when citizens begin seeing each other as enemies. The United States is now closer to that threshold than at any moment since the 1860s. Together, these forces, debt, financial weaponization, and political fragmentation form the deepest existential challenge the U.S. has faced in its modern era. The country still possesses unrivaled power, but that power is becoming harder to project, harder to sustain, and harder to justify. The Colossus still stands tall, but for the first time in generations, its shadow flickers. By the time the Cold War ended, the United States had already dominated the physical world through its military, its currency, and its industrial power. But what came next was even more transformative, because it created a form of power far more subtle, far more pervasive, and far more difficult for the world to escape. If the 20th century belonged to factories, bombs, and steel, then the 21st century belongs to servers, data centers, and the invisible circuitry that now governs modern life. In this new era, America's greatest advantage is not its aircraft carriers or oil reserves, but the fact that it owns the digital infrastructure the world depends on. Most people forget that the internet was not invented by entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. It was born inside the U.S. Department of Defense's ARPANET, a Cold War project meant to preserve communication after a nuclear attack. Its design had nothing to do with convenience or entertainment. It existed to ensure that military command systems could remain functional even if major cities were obliterated. When the Cold War began to fade, Washington did something unexpected. It handed this technology to the private sector. Silicon Valley took it, nurtured it, commercialized it, and transformed it into the most powerful architecture of global influence the modern world has ever seen today. Virtually every essential digital function of everyday life operates on American platforms. When people search for information, they use Google. When they post their personal photos or communicate with family, they use Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp. When they talk, they do so through iPhones manufactured by Apple and running on operating systems made in California. When businesses store sensitive records or run their websites, they rely on Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. Even the basic framework of global computing, the programming languages, the development tools, the cloud architecture, and the productivity software originates overwhelmingly from American companies. This means that a business in Malaysia, a student in France, a government agency in Kenya, and a startup in Brazil are all plugged into the same American-made digital environment, whether they intend to be or not. This dominance comes with an intelligence advantage that the rest of the world finds deeply unsettling. When Edward Snowden revealed the internal workings of American surveillance programs in 2013, it confirmed what many foreign governments feared. The U.S. does not only control the platforms, it can see through them. Under programs like PRISM, intelligence agencies could request or intercept data flowing through giants such as Google, Apple, and Microsoft. In mail metadata, cloud files, call records, messages, search histories, and even location data became accessible under American jurisdiction. While this access is governed by U.S. law, it nonetheless demonstrated a core truth. Any country that allows its citizens and businesses to depend on American digital infrastructure is, in some sense, tethered to American oversight. The geopolitical consequences of this cannot be overstated. In the past, empires built ports and trade routes. The United States now builds digital rails that the world cannot function without. A business cannot scale globally without Google indexing. A developer cannot deploy software without Amazon's cloud servers. A central bank cannot process modern transactions without Visa and MasterCard networks. Even entertainment, one of the most powerful cultural forces on Earth, is shaped by American platforms like Netflix, YouTube, and Disney+. When people in Turkey binge-watch Hollywood movies, or teenagers in Argentina follow TikTok trends created in Los Angeles, or startups in Germany rely on Microsoft Office and Adobe tools, they are participating in a form of soft dependence that no foreign government has the power to fully control. China recognized this dependence early and attempted to escape it by building its own digital ecosystem. WeChat, Alibaba, TikTok, Baidu, Tencent, and a heavily defended Great Firewall. However, the mere existence of such a walled garden proves the underlying American advantage. If China had not sealed its borders digitally, its population would overwhelmingly be using Instagram, Netflix, Google, Amazon, and the same services that dominate the rest of the world. It is a rare acknowledgement from Beijing that American digital influence is so complete that it had to be artificially blocked to preserve sovereignty. The reason this digital footprint matters is captured best by the phrase data is the new oil. The future of artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive analytics, targeted advertising, and digital governance depends entirely on massive pools of data. And the vast majority of that, data billions of messages, photos, searches, transactions, and interactions every day flows through American-controlled systems. If AI becomes the defining tool of the century, then the US already owns the most valuable raw material that fuels it. It also owns the computational power, the talent infrastructure, and the corporate ecosystems that train and deploy advanced AI models. In many ways, this places America in a stronger long-term position than even its post-World War II industrial supremacy. Yet, like every empire before it, this digital supremacy carries weaknesses and looming challenges. China is rapidly expanding its technological influence across Asia and Africa. Europe is pursuing digital sovereignty to distance itself from American surveillance. BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems that bypass US platforms entirely. Countries around the world increasingly worry about allowing American companies to handle their national data. And the once unified global internet is slowly fracturing into competing digital spheres, governed by different rules, different infrastructures, and different values. Even so, the digital empire that the United States constructed intentionally or not has given it a level of influence that is deeper and more pervasive than traditional military power. Nations can resist trade agreements or political alliances, but they cannot easily resist the gravitational pull of the technologies required for modern life. And until another country can offer an ecosystem that rivals the scale, reliability, and cultural reach of America's digital infrastructure, the U.S. will continue to hold a form of dominance that no fleet of warships could ever replicate. If earlier chapters explained how America conquered land, money, and industry, this chapter reveals how it quietly conquered the invisible world that now runs everything. And it is this digital empire unseen yet omnipresent that will determine how long American power can endure in the century ahead. For nearly a century, the United States has operated from a position of extraordinary confidence, almost a kind of geopolitical invincibility. But even the most powerful empires reach a point where external dominance collides with internal strain. This is the beginning of what many analysts call the Great Unraveling, not an immediate collapse. The first and most urgent pillar of this unraveling is the debt spiral, a mathematical truth that no political slogan can disguise. A number so staggering that it eclipses the annual economic output of entire continents. But the real alarm is not the size of the debt. For the first time in modern history, the US government now spends more money servicing past debt merely paying the interest than it spends on its military. This means that the very tool that guaranteed American dominance, the most powerful defense apparatus in human history, debt, of course, is not inherently dangerous. The rest of the world is beginning to ask whether the American system still deserves the unquestioned trust it once commanded. Credit ratings have been quietly downgraded. Foreign central banks have begun reducing their holdings of US treasuries. This is not a collapse, it is a warning, the kind that empires rarely hear until it is too late. The second major pressure point emerged, not from the bond markets, but from a geopolitical decision that seemed justified at the time. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States froze hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian assets and cut the country off from the SWIFT banking system. It was a decisive blow, and in the short term, it worked. But in the long term, it introduced a terrifying precedent. Once Washington demonstrated that it could weaponize the financial system overnight, discussions of de-dollarization moved from fringe speculation to mainstream government policy. Nations began building alternative payment networks, experimenting with digital currencies, and negotiating trade deals that bypassed the dollar entirely. While none of these developments threaten the dollar immediately, they collectively signal a world that no longer assumes the United States will be the default financial heart of the global system. But the third and most dangerous challenge facing the United States cannot be blamed on foreign rivals or external shocks. It comes from inside. The internal polarization of the American political system has reached levels that historians compare to the decades before the Civil War. Government shutdowns have become routine. Debt ceiling crises now occur almost annually. The country is so divided that it struggles to perform even the basic functions of governance. This polarization has consequences far beyond domestic frustration. when Congress becomes unpredictable, investors begin to worry, and when the population becomes so fragmented that half the country views the other half as an existential threat, the cohesion required to maintain global leadership dissolves. No empire can project strength abroad while fighting a psychological civil war at home, and the internal fragmentation of the republic form the backbone of America's modern vulnerability. Unlike military threats, these pressures cannot be deterred with aircraft carriers or neutralized with foreign aid. They stem from structural choices, embedded incentives. Yet even in this period of unraveling, the United States remains a paradox. It is simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than it appears. It has unmatched technological leadership, the most advanced military, and the deepest financial markets. Its universities, companies, and cultural machinery still attract the world's brightest minds, and its currency, despite the threats against it, remains the foundation of global trade. In this sense, the unraveling is not a prediction of collapse, but a recognition that the era of effortless dominance is ending. The United States is no longer a superpower by default. It must work to remain one, but whether it can reinvent itself before the internal and external pressures converge into something irreversible. Every empire in history eventually reaches this crossroads, the moment when its greatest strengths begin to cast the longest shadows. It begins quietly, in spreadsheets, in boardrooms, and legislative dysfunction. In the subtle pivot of global capital, decline begins not with a bang, but with the loss of confidence. A giant still towering over the world, but increasingly unsure of the ground beneath its own feet. What happens next will define not just American history, but the next century of global stability. And for the first time in generations, the outcome is no longer guaranteed. Every empire believes it will last forever. Rome believed it, Britain believed it, the Ottomans, the Persians, the Mongols each imagined they were the final chapter in human progress. But history is merciless. It does not grant permanence, it grants opportunity. And opportunity shifts. Today, the United States stands at a crossroads between dominance and decline. And for the first time since 1945, the world is preparing for a future that may not be American-led. What does that world look like? It begins with fragmentation. Without a single superpower enforcing the rules of the global marketplace, regional powers begin asserting themselves. China expands influence across Asia and Africa. Europe attempts to build a sovereign financial system independent from Washington. India becomes a manufacturing giant. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states pivot between East and West, selling oil in multiple currencies. The world becomes multipolar, a chessboard without a king. Trade becomes more complicated. Alliances become more fluid. The dollar becomes one strong currency among several, not the sun around which the world orbits. Military conflicts become harder to deter, because no single power possesses the authority to stop them. Technology fractures into competing ecosystems, Western, Chinese, and perhaps others. Information itself becomes territorial. Some fear this future. Others see it as inevitable. But one thing is certain, the era where America could shape global outcomes with a phone call, a sanction, or a carrier strike group is fading. And yet, the story is not simply one of decline. America remains one of the most innovative nations on Earth. It still has the deepest capital markets, the most advanced military, and the most influential cultural machinery. Its universities attract the brightest minds, and its companies create technologies that disrupt the global landscape. The fall of an empire does not mean the fall of a nation. It simply means the world stops rotating around it. The real question is whether the United States can transition gracefully from empire to republic, from enforcer to participant, from the center of gravity to one powerful star among many. History suggests that the nations that adapt survive. The ones that cling to old illusions collapse under their own mythology. The United States, for the first time, must decide which one it wants to be.